It's already loaded on there. It's the first thing.
Why are we so far back?
Because in order to get the camera,
Yeah.
to be able to flip around and get that.
Yeah. So far away. Okay.
This is,
I'm not the communications person, so I'm just being a pain. Well, good.
See how I do.
You'll do great.
Taking some shots before I can.
It is nice.
All right, I'll see you in a little bit. Bye.
Hello? Sending the link to the stream to Haley, Susan.
Oh, it's already off.
Yeah.
Well, what?
Well, I'm sending it around so that I can test it as a viewer on my phone, and then I'm gonna mute it.
Okay.
That feeding back in your headphones just then?
Sorry, what?
Was that feeding back in your headphones?
Yeah, if I leave these kind of open, they feed back. So I keep them on my head, always closed.
It's very hard.
It's breaking out.
Those mics are pretty.
Alright.
Sensitive, so I'm not really worried about that.
Okay.
The only thing I'm concerned about is if someone is more soft-spoken, like Sandy, if she starts to talk, the mics aren't gonna pick her up and amplify her that much through the in-room speakers. But we want conversation level talking to be picked up on the stream, which is what it's doing right now, so that I'm fine with.
Testing. That's
Really loud?
have you got it up there?
No, it's my phone is very, the service is not great in this room.
I would maybe. Yeah. Testing. Yeah, because you can tell it's coming from there, whereas I don't know, it sounds like it's coming from that other room. I don't know how it's doing that, but oh shit.
So I'm giving you the audio as a mic output.
Mm-hmm. Which makes yes, I am Mike here.
Okay.
This is what we did last time and it worked out fine. I think you just had it.
Yeah, I don't have any distortion or any slop in it. It's fine.
Sorry?
I don't have any distortion or anything.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Oh, great. Okay, great.
So I think we're good.
Okay.
I'm gonna stay logged in. I'm gonna mute this so that when I send this to the general public, it will not pick up our bullshit conversations until this all starts. Should I'm really going to like 70 on in here. Because it's a little bit dark in the YouTube stream.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I am balanced, but I can up it a little bit.
Crank that exposure a little.
The exposure is at max, but I will flag the ISO.
I'm still getting our audio. Don't know why. Oh, here, I think because so the stream, the Wi-Fi in here is so bad that my phone is like a solid minute behind.
Oh,
So that's a problem, but there's nothing really.
I'm not hearing it, because I have it on mine too, I'm not hearing anything.
You're running the YouTube?
Yeah, so mine, John just left.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's like
There's
5 seconds behind?
Yeah, so there's no audio right now.
Cool, thank you. Much obliged.
Where would you like, you want me to be here for the presentation, right?
Yeah, just in case anything goes wonky with that computer.
Where would you like me to be?
I'm still getting out.
Now your audio is being good.
Doesn't look like we're worse. Does it look, Gary, on the live feed?
Always gives us some trouble when she gets Victoria.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here for the second meeting of the work group on pandemic spending. At our first meeting, we received testimony from Deputy Secretary Mark Nicole of the Department of Budget and Management, who provided us with an overview of spending to combat the public health and economic crises brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year and a half. I would like to once again underscore my support, and I think the support of all of the folks on this work group, for the infusion of federal and state aid that I think we all believe was critical in staving off an economic calamity and was a lifeline to millions of Marylanders who found themselves out of a job, on the verge of losing their homes, and struggling to put food on the table. There's no doubt that this aid was essential, and I continue to believe that in many cases, even more relief was called for. I also believe, however, that with so many taxpayer dollars being dispersed, it is both morally and fiscally prudent that we continue to evaluate these transactions to guard against waste, fraud, and pandemic profiteering. This work group continues to do the important work of oversight and accounting for the billions of taxpayer dollars that have been expended over the last 14 months. I would like to again thank the Hogan administration for their commitment to work closely with us as we fulfill this critically important legislative charge of providing oversight and accounting of pandemic relief programs in Maryland. Just like every work group meeting, this meeting is open to the public, both the live stream and in person, so that Marylanders can see firsthand how their taxpayer money has been spent. Today, we'll hear from top officials from the Department of Commerce and the Department of Housing and Community Development, two vital agencies that were charged with dispersing billions of dollars in state and federal aid to hundreds of thousands of businesses, Marylanders, families, and local governments. I'd like to welcome Sarah Shepard, Director of Education and Workforce for the Maryland Department of Commerce, and Robin Chaconis, Chief of Staff for the Department of Housing and Community Development. It's my hope that both presentations will provide an overview and summary of the pandemic spending activity of their departments to date, which will hopefully provide valuable insights on how this pandemic continues to impact the economic well-being of our residents and businesses. Thank you both for attending. Ms. Shepard, please begin your presentation. We have with us the members of the Workplace Pandemic Spending Work Group, and they will be asking questions of you after your presentation. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
Thank you. So again, I am Sarah Shepard, the Director of Workforce and Education for Department of Commerce. And the past 15 months, I have been overseeing in some capacity or the other all of our pandemic spending programs. So it's been a busy year.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me today. I'm going to give an overview of our relief programs for COVID-19. So in the early days of the pandemic, in March 2020, Commerce established 3 emergency relief programs. A small business grant program, which provided up to $10 million to small businesses across the state. A small business loan program, which provided loans of up to $50,000. I'm sorry, our first grant program was $10,000. and then a special grant program to help Maryland manufacturers produce personal protective equipment and other critically needed items. I'll begin with our grant program, which began with $50 million in funding and was replenished twice in 2020 for a total of $145 million. Grants were for up to $10,000 or 3 months of operating expenses, whichever was lower. Eligible businesses needed 50 or fewer employees, at least one W-2 employee, a valid unemployment insurance number, and they need to be in good standing with SDAT, the State Department of Taxation and Assessment. Our application period was open from March 23rd to April 6th, and we received 17,876 completed applications during that time. We issued 14,293 approved businesses, grants to approved businesses over the course of this program. Our loan program received $75 million in March 2020 and offered loans of up to $50,000 to for-profit businesses. The criteria were the same for the grant program. We received 8,603 applications between March 23rd and April 6th, but funds were exhausted by applications received on March 23rd and 24th. 1,654 loans were issued. These loans were later converted to grants in early 2021, as ordered by Governor Hogan. Businesses that had already begun repaying the loans received refunds. So here we have a few charts showing the geographic and industry breakdown of our grant and loan recipients. The first chart shows our grant recipients, and as you would expect, we see more grants issued to the higher population counties. Here's the corresponding slide for our loan distribution. And then the last two charts I want to share show distribution by industry. The chart for grants shows a particular concentration in sectors such as healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, and professional, scientific, and technical services. Those same trends carry over to our loan programs, where we also saw a sizable number of loans to the construction industry. So moving on to our manufacturing program. As you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, demand for PPE, such as masks, gowns, and face shields, as well as other critically needed items, was very high, but supplies were low. Many manufacturers here in Maryland were ready to set up and assist, but needed a little help either pivoting or ramping up production of these materials. So we created this program, which offered grants of up to $100,000. They were paid in two parts, half up front and half upon completion of the order. $5 million was put into the fund, and we issued 55 grants totaling approximately $4 million. These funds helped businesses produce gowns, face shields, and ventilator components, among other equipment. Those were our initial three programs, but by summer of 2020, it became clear that some 501c6 nonprofit organizations in the state were struggling and needed support as well. Commerce used $1 million in federal funding from the CARES Act to provide grants to organizations such as community organizations, industry groups, business leagues, and tourism destination marketing organizations. We issued 48 grants totaling $475,000, and the remaining funds were reverted back to DHCD. The Department of Commerce is also home to the Maryland State's Arts Council, which began offering its own relief grants to artists and arts organizations in May of 2020. Between then and April 2021, MSAC offered 4 rounds of emergency funding and a 5th round of funding for roster artists with the teaching artist roster and the touring artist roster. 1,645 grants totaling approximately $12 million have been issued to artists, arts organizations, county art agencies, and to managers of our arts and entertainment districts. This is across all 23 counties and Baltimore City. Later in 2020, Commerce provided relief funding that specifically targeted hotels and restaurants, which had been hit particularly hard by the pandemic. Rather than having a statewide application process, as we did with our emergency grants earlier in the year, we provided funds proportional to each county and Baltimore City. Restaurant funds were distributed based on the number of restaurants, hotel funds based on the hotel sales tax collected in each jurisdiction. The local jurisdictions then distributed them to the businesses in their areas. We felt this would ensure more geographic equity, and make sure businesses in Western Maryland weren't competing for the same funding as businesses in Ocean City, for example. So this chart is showing the distribution of funds to the counties for restaurant relief. And this chart is to show the hotel funding. So I also want to note that in November of 2020, we provided $2 million to the local tourism destination marketing organizations in each county. These funds were specifically to support marketing to drive businesses to their stores and their restaurants. Also, that's not on this slide. The slide presentation is MSBDFA, which is the Maryland Small Business Development Financing Authority. We spent a total of $10 million in rainy day funds to provide loans under the MSBDFA program. Under the Emergency Relief Act, we gave up to $50,000 of each loan forgiveness and converted it to a grant. So moving on to the Relief Act. I'm going to give you an overview of our relief funding in 2021. So earlier this year, the Governor's Relief Act of 2021 passed the General Assembly with bipartisan support and contained an array of new funding that Commerce has been providing to Maryland businesses in different ways. The first Relief Act program I'll mention is our Small Business COVID-19 Relief Grant Program. The legislation provided $10 million for grants, up to $9,000 for businesses that do not collect sales and use tax. This was a complement to the sales and use tax credits also established in the legislation. This grant was for businesses such as hair salons, medical offices, and personal and professional services. Restaurants and retail stores, however, were not eligible. Eligible businesses between 1 and 20 employees, at least one W-2 employee, a valid Maryland UI number, and they also had to be in good standing were our requirements. The Relief Act also required that disadvantaged businesses be prioritized and call for geographic diversity among grantees. So we considered those criteria in our review process and our ranking system. In the weeks leading up to the launch of this program, Commerce reached out to the numerous community organizations, business groups, advocacy groups, and local chambers of commerce throughout the state. We accepted applications from March 30th to April 6th, then reopened applications from April 30th until May 24th. We received more than 1,800 applications, but not all met the qualifications. We've issued 1,068 checks so far. So here we have a chart showing the geographic distribution of awarded grants. The Relief Act also provided new funds for restaurant and hotel relief. $22 million for grants of up to $12,000 for restaurants and $10 million for grants of up to $25,000 for hotels. Each county and Baltimore City received funds proportional to their population. So the Relief Act also provided $500,000 for grants to businesses to help set up online sales and expand telework opportunities. Each county and Baltimore City received funds proportioned to their populations as well. And here's the breakdown of that as well. So this is the breakdown of restaurants, hotels, and online sales. So additional provisions for the Relief Act included $5 million in additional funding for MSAC for grants to artists and organizations. 839 grants have been issued to 659 individuals and 180 organizations. $10 million in additional funds for the Small Minority Woman-Owned Business Account, which is referred to as the MOBA or the BLT Fund program. $8 million for commuter shuttle bus services, where we issued grants to 6 companies based on conversations with MTA, and then $1 million to the Maryland Tourism Development Board to support Maryland small business marketing. So here's probably part of what you guys are really interested in is how we verify our applications. After 15 months of doing all these grants and loans, we've gotten it kind of down back on low, I think. So we've honed that in from our early days. So I want to say a little bit about our review process. The steps our teams took to verify the information in each application for our small business relief programs. They took the Maryland unemployment number and federal tax ID number included in each application and verified it against state and federal data. We required applicants to provide evidence of financial loss, such as tax returns and profit and loss statements. We required proof of good standing with SSTAT. Businesses need to provide proof that they had W-2 employees. For this relief round, we allowed the W-2 employee to be the owner themselves, as they were excluded in the first rounds. So we asked for a copy of their W-2 statements. We also required businesses to provide their NAICS code to show they were in an industry where they did not collect sales and use tax. And we reviewed applications for any duplicates, which we refer to as the deduping process. So with that, a lot of our small businesses applied multiple times because they had issues with their application, and it was just easier for them to reapply than trying to edit their original application. So we had our team go through and cross-reference their unemployment insurance number, their federal ID numbers, and then just their names or emails associated with the account to verify that they were not a duplicate application. And that's what we also did for our first round for the CARES Act funding. So one of the questions we were asked to address in this meeting is whether Commerce discovered any fraudulent payments made in our program. The answer to that is a firm no. We are not aware of any businesses that receive payments through fraud or deception. Out of thousands of applications we've received over the last 16 months, we identified 3 businesses, 1 in 2020 and 2 in 2021, that appeared to have provided falsified documents in support of their application. After further investigation, they were denied. We also figured that, so if it should happen to discover in the future that businesses did obtain money through fraud, we will inform them that they need to return the funds and will work with the Office of the Attorney General to pursue legal action as appropriate. So this next slide is on duplicate checks. I will note that over the course of the past year, we found that processing errors led to 56 businesses being issued duplicate checks and 4 were processed for incorrect amounts, leading to overpayments. Most checks were either returned or canceled, or the businesses have agreed to repay the funds in installments as they are able. It is important to note here that the grant loan programs were set up very quickly and operated on a scale far larger than any of Commerce's usual business assistance programs. The nature of this pandemic and the urgency with which our businesses community needed relief means that we did not really have time to create this program before we began accepting applications. We had to build a new IT system to handle the volume of applications we received in those initial days. We brought in more than 100 staffers from other state agencies to help review and process applications.
Thank you.
This was an all hands on deck effort at Commerce. Unfortunately, as we were working quickly and building the airplane as we were flying it, so to speak, these processing errors did slip through. But we have identified them, corrected them as they came to light, and are working with the remaining businesses to ensure the funds are returned to the state. So that concludes my presentation, prepared remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Ms. Shepard, thank you very much. That is not a dental office next to us. That was some construction noise that was going on. But thank you. That was a very helpful, very insightful presentation. If you would thank, please, your leadership and the secretary. Once again, we're on a hunt for best practices. And how do we get lessons learned from what we've all gone through? So I thought you were very helpful and insightful. We happen to be the paymaster in the comptroller's office. We put the checks in the mail for all recipients of state COVID pandemic relief programs. And while we account for the number and dollar figure behind the transactions, the details you have provided today are extremely helpful as we comply with what the legislature has ordered us to do. And given, if I could ask a few questions, and then I'll turn it over to the other members of the work group. Given the relatively limited pot of money, both state and federal, that the Department of Commerce received for pandemic relief, I'm curious, how did the department decide which industries were targeted for funding, how much was allotted, and perhaps more importantly, how did you decide which jurisdictions received priority?
So if you're referring to our Relief Act programs, not our initial COVID-19 programs, because that was done first in, first out by applications. For the Relief Act program, per the legislation, we broke it down about how much each jurisdiction could receive. So especially for the non-sales and tax use one, because that was a little bit more detailed for the Department of Commerce. We broke down each county out of the pot of money that we were given by their population, which was what was required of us. So from there, we had different groups of our review team. So they had different jurisdictions and clusters of counties that they reviewed. And then they had a ranking system. So our guru at the Department of Commerce came up with this great ranking system of how each one would get kind of a rank in our internal online platform that would be assigned to them. So after that was done, so based on the NAICS codes of what we saw from pandemic and all the federal data and state data, we could kind of determine which industries were hurting the most. We also had questions about disparate businesses. So in there, it was based on your net worth, because that's the federal definition of it. And then we also had a self-reporting part for different groups, gender classifications and so forth, veteran-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses. But that was all not required. It was voluntarily self-reported. So we didn't use that in the ranking system. But for the counties, we did have some that were oversubscribed and undersubscribed counties. We reached out to those counties specifically to say, we still have X amount of dollars in the pot for your county businesses. They're interested in it, but the demand wasn't there. So once we exhausted all those efforts and continually to work with those counties, we then gave the rest of the money to some of the oversubscribed counties based on first in, first out, and their ranking for their NAICS codes and the amount of need.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And just remind me again, the slides went by very quickly. How many pandemic relief programs were you administering?
I'm gonna have to count because I lose track after all this time. So we have 8 right now for relief that we administer. So 7 for the COVID-19, I believe. My numbers may be wrong. It's all a blur at this point. And then I believe 8 or 9 for Relief Act.
Okay.
So a pretty significant amount, which is also why this presentation was so long.
No, that's fine.
Thank you for listening.
If we could just focus a little bit on the grant and loan fund programs. These two programs obviously were critical lifelines at the beginning of the pandemic because tens of thousands of businesses were ordered, in effect, by the state, understandably, to shut down in response to the COVID crisis. In total, how many of these businesses applied for the grant program and have received a grant award, approximately?
So beginning for our 2020 grant program, we had 17,876 applicants that completed their application. Now we have quite a few that were in draft status and never submitted. So a little under 18,000. And because of all of our continuous funding and refunding of the program over 2020, we were able to provide grants to 14,293.
Excellent.
businesses.
And how many applied for the loan program and how many received the loan, approximately?
So we received 8,603 applications for the loan. And because that pot was a lot smaller, we only were able to give out 1,654 loans.
Okay, and once again, looking for best practices down the road, if we could just kind of get into the details a little bit about the disbursement of these two programs by industry and jurisdiction. First, let's start with jurisdiction. As you know, Prince George's County is the second largest jurisdiction in our state, comprising 15% of Maryland's population. And just by comparison, the state's big 4 jurisdictions, referencing, of course, Maryland's 4 largest jurisdictions by population. Prince George's County appears to not have received its fair share when compared to the other big 4 jurisdictions. And I see from the reports that posted on its website that one of the metrics it uses on its report is the number of qualified private establishments per jurisdiction. which is defined by the department as establishments that are privately owned and employed between 1 and 49 employees in the first quarter. But if you could just, let's start with that metric. Prince George's County, according to your own data, has 10.7% of the total number of qualified private establishments that applied for the grant program. Montgomery, my home county, had an identical percentage. Yet looking at your own figures, Montgomery County received over twice as many grants as Prince George's County, despite having virtually the same number of applications received. In other words, 26.2 million or 2,646 awards for Montgomery versus half of that, 12.5 million or 1,270 awards for Prince George's. Can you just comment, and there may be an explanation for that I'm missing? How did Prince George's end up receiving half as many awards as Montgomery County when both Prince George's and Montgomery have an identical percentage of qualified applicants?
So again, this program was announced and immediately started accepting applications the moment it was announced during our press conference on March 23rd, 2020. The numbers that you see are based on the applicants that applied. So if they were qualified businesses, that's how it was done, by first in, first out. There was no rhyme or reason in this programming as to population size. This is just kind of a breakdown for us internally and then for our external partners later on about how it was divided up. There was no reasoning for that. It wasn't done by county population, which is why in the Relief Act, we decided to have it broken down by county population as best as possible. So it also gave us some lessons learned on outreach and messaging and working with some of our county partners, especially some of our smaller county partners, not just our big chambers of commerce and economic development boards, but actually getting to some of the grassroots organizations to help their businesses. And so that's what we were really amping up a lot of our communications this past round to try and make sure that all these different businesses in some of these counties got their fair share.
Okay, so that's, thank you for that. That's the grant program. If we could just take a look at the loan program, according to your report, 1,654 loans were provided, totaling 75.2 million. Prince George's County had 1.2% of qualified private establishments apply. Montgomery had 1% of the qualified applicants. Similar to the grant program, we once again see this disparity in the loan awards. Prince George's received 6.6 million, representing 145 recipients, compared to Montgomery, which received almost double that, 11.7 million, representing 250 recipients. If you could just give us some testimony on that.
It's the exact same as for our grant program. There was nothing different. We noticed while doing this, the people who applied our first 2 days for the grant programs also applied the first 2 days of the loan program. So that just is how they kind of did it both at times. They applied for the grant, then they went over and applied for the loan, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So again, we didn't do it by population. That's just a breakdown so we can see, especially when we were talking with our state partners about how it was broken down. But there was no rhyme or reason. It was first in, first out.
Right. So you can see, Mr. Schaffel, who's head of our Bureau of Revenue Estimates. Go
Well,
ahead.
thank you, sir. And I didn't want to interrupt. It seems that at what time frame was this occurring?
So March 23rd, 2020,
March 23rd, 2020. Okay.
and
So
we
right at
ended
the
up April
beginning.
6th.
Right. Okay. So we didn't really know how everybody was going to be affected by industry and by geography yet.
And there were some businesses that applied later on.
Mhm.
Thankfully, they got grant funding, maybe not for the loans, because they didn't realize how significant, no one knew at the time,
Right.
how badly they were going to be impacted.
Yeah. Agreed. I think we had a pretty good feeling we knew something really big was coming down the pike, right? I am just a little surprised that we didn't approach this from more of a policy standpoint for providing the loans as opposed to, first in, first out, right? It sounds like you've taken that as a lesson learned.
Yes, we have.
Do you know how many were rejected by county, by any chance?
I don't have that on me. I can probably get our research team to break that down and send that around later. But I don't have that off the top of my head how many were rejected by county.
Sorry.
And a lot of times it wasn't even, so we exhausted our funds. They were automatically rejected based on first in, first out. But there were quite a few businesses that were rejected because they submitted duplicate applications. So one of them got in, but their duplicates didn't. Or it was based on whether they met the criteria. So a lot of businesses did not meet our criteria, which was at least one employee.
Well, thank you for that. I think there's an underlying concern here about the disbursement, which per jurisdiction, because although the explanation makes sense, the actual allocation of dollars, I think is just something that we need to take a look at. And I know that the General Accounting Division under Sandy Zink, who's here on the workforce, we're concerned about those trends, particularly because Prince George's County and Baltimore City, two majority-minority jurisdictions, have really borne the brunt of the public health and economic consequences of the pandemic. So we have something that made sense perhaps then, but now looks in retrospect as if it was, a disbursement that should have been made otherwise. We totaled all the payments funded by state dollars that were dispersed to pandemic relief recipients per jurisdiction. And here's what we found for Prince George's and Baltimore City. Compared to their neighbors, I said my home county, Montgomery, and Baltimore County up near Baltimore. Prince George's County, 13.3 million. Montgomery County, more than double that, 28 million. Baltimore City, 16 million. Baltimore County, 24 million. So I just have a couple of questions, and then I'll turn it over to everyone else to ask a few questions. Looking at the distribution by industry, my experts did a spreadsheet comparing which industries the commerce dollars went to compared to the job losses that those industries experienced over the last year. I'm particularly interested in getting your thoughts on professional, scientific, and technical services industries. And the question is, does that category include law firms?
So, yeah, without looking at exactly and how it's broken down, yes, it does include law firms and accounting firms and other professional services.
I have nothing against lawyers. I'm one myself. But according to our data, that sector received approximately 13% of all commerce funds, while the industry itself, the sector itself, represented about 3% of the job losses. So 13% of the funds, 3% of the job losses. And compared that with the food service industry, which we all know was devastated by the pandemic, that industry got about 17% of commerce funds, but it accounted for nearly 33% of the job losses in the state. Could you just comment on how the department decided to disperse the funds by industry and whether you think that's going to be looked at as something needing review?
So we, again, for our first 2020 round of funding, did not look at it by industry. It was all first in, first out. For the grants, we funded every business that was qualified. We funded at the end of the day. We were given a pot of money. We actually had a surplus because not all of them were qualified businesses. So we funded every single application for grants. Loans, we weren't so fortunate, but that's what happened. For our non-sales and use tax grants and the relief tax funding, the way the legislation was written, and we actually spoke extensively with the comptroller's office and members of your staff to figure out what that meant. And there wasn't a clear-cut definition. So the best was businesses that didn't collect or they minimally collected sales and use tax. So a lot of those are professional services. Some of those are law firms. Some of those are accountants again. A lot of beauty salons, because they might sell some product, but it's very minimal compared to the rest of what they offer and provide in different companies, industries like that. So also with the NAICS code, it's self-reported. We can try and break it down and verify them, but not all NAICS codes are properly reported by the individual. So we tried our best to do that, but some of these numbers you're seeing may not be exact for those industries.
Got it. And just two quick questions. How many grants or loans went to businesses that ended up permanently closing?
So I don't know that number off the top of my head. I can ask to see, but we don't have a full accounting of that either. We would see certain businesses that we knew got our grants and loans, and then we'd see that they had closed their doors eventually, but we don't have a steady tracking number of that.
Okay, and then this may have been on the slide, but what steps did you take to confirm that the recipients were Maryland businesses, as those were, I think, intended exclusively, your grants for Maryland businesses? I saw some of the commerce funds went to out-of-state entities.
Yes, so every business had to be in good standing and registered with Maryland staff. So first off, that was one of our first steps that our application reviewers and then management review and approval checked, was to make sure they were registered as doing business in Maryland. If they weren't, we would go back to them and say, you qualify for this, but you're not in good standing or you're not even registered. If you want this funding, we suggest you do this and resubmit your application, which quite a few businesses did that. So that was our first thing. We also had the unemployment insurance number and would verify with the Department of Labor to make sure that those accounts were actually active Maryland accounts and that there were employees there. So for our 4 out-of-state recipients, they're from nonprofits from the first round of funding, and they were Support Our Aging Religious Inc., their headquarters are in DC, Us Helping Us, People into Living Inc., also in DC, Generating Hope, DC, and then the Delmarva Council of the Boy Scouts. After speaking with all of those organizations extensively, we were able to determine that those out-of-state companies were technically headquartered outside of the state, but we concluded their operations and employees in Maryland were significant enough that they were allowed to receive the grant.
Excellent. And let me just turn it over to the work group. Sharon Bernardi is our indispensable deputy comptroller. Andy Schaffel asked a question earlier, who's head of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. David Hildebrand is responsible for all things fraud related and risk related. So Chris Riley is here as director of our biggest division, compliance. And then Sandy Zink, who's head of our general accounting division. So Sharon, would you like to start?
Sure, I had a couple of questions, I guess, just related back to the outreach piece. Could you detail the type of marketing programs that you had in place to bring awareness to the grants and loans? And was there assistance provided for applicants? Because it appears as if some people had difficulty, especially from certain groups, with the application and grant process.
So for our initial grant loan program, again, we took a lot of lessons learned from 2020 versus 2021. So our initial grant loan program, it was a lot of word of mouth. We did do marketing. We had our Maryland Pulse distribution list, which has thousands of businesses that are in the area and the different councils and community groups and nonprofits. We put it out on all our socials and then the press conferences that came out, all detailed those things. So we noticed, and again, based on geographic breakdown and the kinds of businesses and groups that are in certain counties, we realized that the press conferences, while great, reached a huge number because we had thousands and thousands in the first few hours, that we didn't expect to be flooded by all that amount in 2020. We realized that not everybody listens to the press conferences. There was a disconnect there. So while amping up our Relief Act funding, we really we worked with the Maryland General Assembly, we worked with different caucuses within the General Assembly and leaders and members. We also worked with all of our Chamber of Commerce's, Minority Chamber of Commerce's, just different groups in those allocations, our nonprofits that we were partners with, and really tried to get as many people as possible. The list goes on, but we did a lot more broader outreach and not just expecting we're posting this on social, everybody's going to see it. There are some people that don't use social media. So how do we get this messaging out to them?
Does it seem in retrospect, like in March 2020, this first in, first out policy, just because of its simplicity, was basically ended up as an abuse of the system in the sense that lawyers like me who are well plugged in and easy to, fluent with grants and stuff, we're able to get in. But the people that were at that point, everybody went up to the front of the line. It's like if we had a vaccination program where, certain people could just go up and get a vaccination and other people had to be appealed to by their caucuses or something. I don't know, but it seems overly simplistic to me. And I wonder how long that first in, first out policy was in place.
So I think the use of the system is strong. I know that there were quite a bit of industry groups, even like Maryland Restaurant Association, the Retail Association, and the Dentist Association, for instance. They all had reached out to their members. And of course, you have to be a member to have gotten that information. So a lot of them were plugged in because they had that outreach as well from their associations. While it was our strong belief, and based on the numbers that we saw and their profit and loss statements, that every single business in the state of Maryland was negatively impacted. Now, some are able to pivot and thrive and are doing better now than they had been post-pandemic based on their profit and losses, but every business has been suffering, including law firms. I mean, the courts were closed, so a lot of their billables are based on court appearances and fees, and that didn't happen for quite some time unless it was an emergency. So everyone was impacted and had a negative hit.
How would you change it in now that you're benefit of 2020? But what is it that we should view as, because it's inherently not discriminatory, but it's unfair. It's unfair for different jurisdictions to feel as if maybe because of the nature of how it was communicated, they didn't get their fair share. That's the question.
So hopefully we don't have another pandemic and we never have to do this again. Fingers crossed. That's, one thing, but we have taken our lessons learned. And I think the big thing was we knew that all these closures were coming. There were conversations. We knew that the ramp up and hospitalizations were starting to increase, and so that's when the announcement was going to be made. We set up a program when practically the day before it was announced, and not everything was in place. We found out that initial platform that we were using could not hold the amount of traffic that was coming and kept breaking, so we had to pivot to another online platform. And again, we were filling the thing as we were flying it. So some of these policy decisions were really broad stroked to do the first in, first out, because again, we all agreed that every business was suffering at that point in time. Now later on, maybe a few months down the road, when more funding came available, they may not have been suffering, but the amount of applications that we had to go through with what was originally, I think, 8 Department of Commerce staffers, and then we sent out to our state partners asking for them to lend us some of their employees to help us with this process because we just couldn't get through it fast enough. It was really hard.
We supported that.
Yes, you
Did
did,
it?
and we appreciate it greatly, especially on our portfolio side and some of our other kind of pieces. So we had over 100 volunteers from other agencies that we were then managing in a new remote telework world. And it just, the infrastructure just wasn't there to be able to put up, bigger policy decisions more than first in, first out. I think had we been given more notice, we may have been able to break that down better, but our main goal is just helping as many people as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Schaffel, and then Mr. Hildebrand.
I did have another question.
Oh, I'm
too.
sorry. Go ahead. No, I
That's
apologize.
I had a question regarding since you're talking about lessons learned, the application and verification process, some of the information was self-reported, and wanted to know if the W-2 information, the tax returns, were they certified or were they also self-reported? And if they were self-reported from a lessons learned perspective, do you have any plans for post-audit?
So, great question. So we either accepted in that part tax returns or profit and loss statements. So the profit and loss statements are self-generated. A lot of them came from third-party generators, but again, they're quickly getting these things done, first in, first out. The businesses were just uploading what they had. So we were pretty generous on forms of profit and loss statements that we were accepting. The tax returns, again, we checked the federal, their, EIN numbers, and then for the W-2 statements, we did go in, review those, and confirm them with the Department of Labor. So that's how we did it. We actually have our own internal auditing system, and they just came back with their report. That hasn't been released publicly yet, but they found no red flags in any of our processes.
Just trying to think of if the vaccine program had been first come, first serve, and what that would have looked like, and what we would have regretted probably looking back. But I'm not seeking to, your testimony is very helpful to us
Well, I
in
think
trying to
with the
figure this
vaccine
out.
program too, we knew that was coming, and we had longer times to figure out, to break down those groups of people, and when it was finally made available, how we were going to do that and disperse it. We had a whole roadmap and plan. This we didn't see coming, at least not as long as we did a vaccine.
Deputy Comptroller, do you have
No.
anything else?
No.
Thank you. And Mr. Schaffel?
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. Just wanted to follow up on the P&L a little bit. You mentioned you were requiring, you wanted to see that they had taken some sort of financial hit. But in March and April, things were pretty brand new. Were they really showing sizable hits at that point in time?
So a lot of our hits were the 2020 program, where we could see, based on if they had their March statements thus far, how much significantly had gone down. Not everybody had their March statements, and obviously we didn't have, not everybody had even submitted their 2019 tax returns yet.
Right.
So our they had a little narrative to put about how they've been negatively impacted and what's happening to them. And we took that mainly as that negative impact because we knew that all the businesses were shut down
Okay, so
for the most part.
it was a little bit objective in terms of, they were anticipating something, not
Yeah,
necessarily.
our review wasn't as objective towards that, but we did have an overall policy of every business was suffering.
Mhm.
Or especially as we got to months later down the road when more funding became available, we truly knew that they can hit hard.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think, to your point, hopefully, we never have to use these lessons learned. This is a once in a century issue, but I do think this is going to change the way that government forever responds to any kind of recession. So I do think that we're going to end up using these types of programs. I think this is going to be the new normal in response. So I do think there's a lot of value to digging into these, and I think we'll use them sooner than we want to. But I think that the idea of helping to stand up the PPP manufacturers was a really, really interesting idea. Do you have some information on what the results were there? We saw the money that went out, but I don't know how much we were able to produce.
Yeah, so I don't have all that information right now. I did not oversee that program as closely as the other ones. So the PPP program, though, I know that we distributed masks, ventilator parts, gowns. So that's why it was done in two benchmarks. So they received their first amount of funding at the beginning, and then upon completion, they received additional money once they delivered what we had asked them to deliver. So I think that we're still kind of breaking out all of that and what the research numbers are, but I'm happy to talk to our team and try and get more information on that.
Sure, yeah, I think we're going to be, I mean, a big part of what we're going to want to do is assess the success of the programs, and part of that's going to be, certainly going to be database. So I think we can get there. Certainly going to be curious about the reasons that certain companies were rejected, and if there was a scoring of why they were rejected, I would think that might help with the outreach. We might even do that before the next time these programs are needed, right?
Yes,
Try to
I
coach
do know
these
there was
guys
a
up.
scoring rubric and that they did kind of validate the businesses and whether or not they could truly deliver
Mhm.
on what they were promising and whether they were in good standing. I know that there was conversation with the Department of Labor again for the OSHA requirements and things like that too, and whether they were in good standing with labor. So there was a lot of work put into that and a lot of manual review and team reviews. So we didn't have as many applicants for that program, but we funded all the ones that we could.
Could I ask you then that, would you be willing to provide that data to us as far as the businesses and those types of reasons, so we could sit through that and kind of get a feeling for it ourselves?
I can ask if we can provide that data. I'm sure it's public.
Yeah, I would imagine we could FOIA it if we
Yeah,
asked.
so we'll have, I can get that.
Great, thank you.
Let me just ask Mr. Hildebrand, who is the head of risk management for the agency. David, do you have any questions?
Yes, sir. I have a couple. Since Andy had just touched on the manufacturing emergency supplies, out of the 55 grants that were issued, you said half was upfront and then other was paid. Were there any that didn't deliver, that didn't get that second payment?
I don't believe so, but I'll have to check that one.
Then another question on when you talked about the applications. So overall, have you analyzed how many of those were not just, they had issues with the application, but were bad actors trying to apply? Have you looked through of all the different things you've done? Have you all had a chance to look at that?
So I don't want to say necessarily bad actors. We haven't analyzed that number because it didn't matter because we had a review process and then sort of a resolutions team that was set up in place. And for our 2020 round, for our 21 round, we didn't have resolutions. It was, this is all we need from you if you don't get it right, because it wasn't first in, first out. So we had a resolutions team that would go back and say, we noticed that your unemployment insurance number has been marked as all zeros, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Can you provide us with an accurate unemployment insurance number, or can you provide us with your W and or a W-2 statement to verify that? So most couldn't. So then they were denied after the second time going back for resolutions. That's kind of how we caught. And I wouldn't say they were bad actors. I think people were frantically applying for whatever they could and maybe not reading all the requirements, not understanding what all the requirements meant, thinking I'm my own employee. I'm a sole proprietor, I'm my employee. I don't pay into, not all sole proprietors pay into unemployment insurance. So they would just put all zeros. That's what they were guided to do. Some were other more intricate numbers or phone numbers or their EIN number. So we saw a lot of more in the unemployment insurance number reporting. As we've been going through resolutions actually further down the road, we know that people were putting their confirmation number for receiving unemployment, not their actual employer unemployment insurance number.
Okay. Do you have a total of what the actual pandemic spending that your agency received was, and how much of that was state money total, and then how much was state?
So again, this is kind of a fluid number. So from federal, my calculations are about $184 million that was spent, and from state, about $195 million. Now those numbers are probably going to change because we do have leftover federal dollars. I don't know the exact amount, but as we're going through the process, we are converting things with the Treasury's office to the CARES Act funding and reverting our rainy day fund back to them. So again, as we're doing our final reconciliations for the end of the fiscal year, those numbers are changing.
Okay. So out of all of that money to manage the various programs, were you able to use any of those funds to add staff or resources to help manage, to do, you said you had to build a whole new system on the fly, flying the plane while you build it?
So those actual funds, and I'm not the budget or HR team, but I do work closely with them. So all of our funds, when we were told we had $50 million to spend for a program, we spent all of that $50 million on our applicants. So it was mainly a volunteer staff. Now we did for accounts payable and a few other units, such as our portfolio upload piece before it gets to accounts payable. We had some temp workers that we paid, and that came out of commerce funding. that wasn't as of right now. I'm not sure how those numbers break down, but out of the money that was designated to us for a program, all that money went to the applicant.
Okay, so if I'm hearing right, you had, I know you mentioned you had like 100 other state staff and some temps. So other than the temp staff you've got to manage basically 2 years worth of spending in a year kind of thing, that was absorbed by your existing staff controls? Okay. And you mentioned one internal audit report. Have you had any other audits put in place, conducted, about to be conducted? So, again, the focus of this is to make sure that that money went to legitimate Maryland citizens and businesses. So of course, I'm going to focus on that as the risk management guy.
Yes, so the only one that I have seen is our grant and loan, so a lot of audit for both our grant program and our loan program. I have not seen, I'm sure that we have an internal audit on all our programs. So I'm sure if it has been done yet, it's in the works right now. And then we'll be audited, obviously, by the
You got it.
legislature.
If there is a suitable summary that could be given, we'd love to see those as, from the report to when we have. Otherwise it'll end up in the OLA report. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Mr. Riley, Head of Compliance, if you could follow.
Thank you, Ms. Shepherd. Thank you for the information. Appreciate the frankness, with which you have discussed the best practices and lessons learned. I did have a couple of quick questions, and the first question was, how quickly were the applications either approved or rejected? I mean, I understand, not 1 day, 1.2 days, but how did that go?
So the one we had, again, we kept getting refunded. So we originally reviewed every single application that came through. And then it was stuck to management review. So we only reviewed up until we had all the funding that we had in the end, the amount that were fundable. Once we extended all our funding, we stopped reviewing on that point. Then once money became available, we kept funding. So it was a 9-month process of review and projecting. I believe the first big batch started coming out at the end of April to early May, because again, the load was so high at the time, and we didn't have enough staff, and we were desperately trying to find more staff to help, that we did not review them as quickly as we would like to. This time around, we had everything set in place, we had infrastructure in place, and knew what we were getting into for the relief act funding, and it was a much more well-oiled machine at that point. So, I don't know if that really answers your question.
No, it did. I mean, it was one of those things. And a second question is, does Commerce plan to do any type of follow-up with the businesses that have received grant money to see what the success of the use of that money was? I mean, now we've given all this money out, $200, $300 million. Is there any follow-up that you guys are considering with them?
So we haven't had anything finalized yet.
But there is a thought process that you would follow up.
Yes.
And if you do decide to do that, when you do that, could you share that information? Obviously, this group would be interested, in what the success of that money was that was given out. I mean, I agree with Andy and the controller and everyone else. We certainly hope that we never have to go through this again, but this will certainly help us out with lessons learned if indeed we ever have to do this. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Yes, in other words, keep us in the loop. Thank you, Chris. And Sandy Zink, Head of General Accounting Division, please, Sandy, welcome.
Hi, Sarah. I know our teams work very closely together through this COVID, and I'm with you. I'm hoping we never end up doing this again, right? Hopefully we never find ourselves there. I think as I listen to you, the one thing I would say is kudos to the team for the effort. It was heroic, no question, on all parts, just trying to get through the process, start to finish. One of the things that we saw as we had a kind of look under the covers, because we were obviously partnering with you guys every step of the way. I was looking at some of the applications and some of the tools that you built, which I thought were really pretty slick. And curious, are you going to be able to take those same tools and create some more efficiencies from a routine payables perspective? Because as I'm looking at the detail of what you pulled together, it was very good.
So I think that is a matter of, so we're looking at some of those different tools and resources that we can use during this to kind of make that standard operating procedure. I'm not sure where our leadership falls on what we can and can't do on that, but we're definitely always looking to be more nimble in the future. You know, as you know, we have a lot of different systems throughout all the state agencies and all of that. There's,
Yes.
so, you know, maybe we could all a more succinct system, but
Yeah, I thought you all did a very good job. Once the plane started flying, it worked very well. So I think we can all create some efficiencies based on some of the tools you guys built. So thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Sandy. And Ms. Shepherd, thank you very much. It's been an excellent presentation. And if we could move to Ms. Chaconis.
And if you have any other further questions, please reach out.
Yeah.
Could I ask a quick question? I apologize, my name is Liz Rubin, I'm a lawyer here in Minneapolis. I'm wondering, you touched on this briefly, but there's, I understand that people who are unemployed, who own a business, such as a law firm, would apply for a grant. Was there any, I'm wondering if there was any, what's the word, knowledge of people duplicating, not only applying for a grant or a loan, but also applying for unemployment, like state unemployment and then the extra federal bonus for unemployment. I wonder if there's any duplicative, bonus money being paid to certain individuals.
So I will say that we work very closely with all of our state agencies to kind of cross-reference various applications. For instance, PhD is going to talk here, but we work really closely with all of our nonprofits to make sure that there weren't duplicates, double handout per se. So if they got something from us, they couldn't get something from DHC. Now for unemployment insurance benefits, it's a little different because obviously there were companies who, I'll use the restaurants as an example. So restaurants closed their doors. Not all of them could provide carryout service. Those who could try, or they found out that it just wasn't profitable to do so while their restaurants were actually open. They had to lay off their staff. So the staff is applying for those unemployment insurance benefits. The business isn't receiving those. So this money was intended to help with all the costs such as rent, regular operating expenses, and also payroll. So we were really hoping that if they could keep staff on pay with some of this funding, that they would do so. So I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but it's kind of where that is. I will say the other piece of the puzzle with unemployment is that we did have sole proprietors, especially, or 1099s, for instance, that have their own business. They eventually, in the summer, were able to apply for unemployment, even though they in the past haven't been able to apply for unemployment. Those individuals were not eligible for our program.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, I think the next work group next month is going to be on unemployment, so we will have some good information there. Please come back. Thank you for being a member of the public and assisting us. And Ms. Shepherd, thank you for everything. Please give my regards to the secretary. And we're now going to hear from Robin Chaconis, Chief of Staff of the Department of Housing and Community Development. If you could give my personal greetings to Secretary Holt. And
I will do that.
My, respect for him is obviously very high. And thank you. And please give us your presentation.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, my name is Robin Chaconis. I'm the Chief of Staff at the Department of Housing and Community Development. I've been with the department in a variety of capacities for 10 years. So I'm pleased to be serving the department as Chief of Staff now. I'm also really happy to be here I think our department has done some really fantastic work over the past 14 months. I'm happy to share it all with you and answer any questions that you may have. I also just want to take a minute and thank Sandy. We haven't met face-to-face before, but we've shared many emails over the years, and thank you for all your hard work. Okay, so over the past 14 months and looking into the future, DHCD will be administering over $1.7 billion related to the pandemic and the economic recovery. This money will be flowing through the department basically in 5 stages. We set up brand new programs. We deployed those funds very effectively to date. We wanted to get the money out to Marylanders as quick as possible. We worked with a lot of stakeholders, a lot of partners, a lot of other state agencies. The Department of Commerce was a great partner that we were actively engaged with. And also through this process, we've done a lot of careful execution with program development, how we awarded the funds, and now we're entering into compliance and reporting phases for many of the programs. I'll spend the first few minutes giving you a high-level overview of our programs and the funding because there are several. And then at the back end of the presentation, I'll go through some of the tables that show how the funds were distributed. Back in May of 2020, through the CARES Act, DHCD was provided $52 million through existing federal programs. It was the first money to come to the department. It came through 3 vehicles, Community Development Block Grant. We had 3 rounds, Emergency Services Grants, and Community Services Block Grant. These were all done through formula with requirements of those programs, and we are still spending down some of that money. All that money went to counties, continuums of care, and community action agencies. In the fall, the governor announced another round of funding that came to the department. Those funds were for rental assistance, nonprofit assistance, entertainment venues, Main Street, and broadband. In January, through the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, the department was allocated roughly $250 million for rental assistance. I'll talk about that in more detail in a few minutes. Then in February, February of 2021, the Relief Act was passed. Funding was provided to the department for emergency housing programs, additional nonprofit assistance that was to go through the local governments, entertainment venues and Main Street assistance, and also another round for broadband expansion. In April of 2021, through the American Rescue Plan, DHCD will be allocated funds for additional rental assistance and mortgage assistance. Broadband funds will come to DHCD. We'll be getting an allotment of home funds, which is an existing federal program. And we will also be getting some additional vouchers for tenants that are in emergency homelessness prevention. Lastly, DHCD will be involved in the allocation of funds to the local municipalities through the American Rescue Plan. We're in the process of getting that started right now. We're working with the Department of Budget and Management. So across the past 14 months, again, $1.78 billion. I know a question coming to me is how much of that is state dollars? It's about 35 million, and the balance is federal funds. So I talked a little bit already about the 3 programs that got money back in May of 2020, CDBG, ESG, and CSBG. This table shows you how much was allocated to DHCD across those programs, how they were distributed. All of them were distributed by formula and application. We have encumbered all of those funds. These were really critical funds because they were the first to hit the street through DHCD. These funds have longer time span to spend. So as other funds started becoming available in the fall, in the summer and into the fall, some of the counties and nonprofits have pivoted over to using other funds first, rental assistance, food bank, services for seniors and the disabled. And these funds, they will continue to draw down through that time frame, 2024 and 2025. But this shows you how much has been spent to date. In the fall of 2020, the governor announced funds for DHCD through the CARES Act, CRF funding, CARES Act CRF, which also has gear funds for broadband and some rainy day funds for business, entertainment venues, and main streets. So this table shows you how the funds, what the purpose of the funds were, who the recipients, the general base of recipients, how much we have encumbered, and how much has been drawn down against. As you can see from this chart, every single one of these programs is fully spent. The broadband expansion is the only one that is still in progress. That gear money will be used to build infrastructure for school districts, and they are still in their mapping and identification of state assets so that they can figure out how to build that network. We're in communication with the Department of Education with this particular pot of money, and that will be an effort that will continue on through the next year. In January of 2021, the Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2021 allotted $258 million to DHCD for rental assistance. The department spent February, March, and April mapping out the plan. We had a work group with legislators to develop the plan, and we are now in implementation phase. All programs are open for tenant application as of May 15th. We have a $40 million state program for assisted housing properties where the landlords apply directly to the state, to our department. We also allocated $193 million across the 24 jurisdictions for their rental assistance programs. All of them are open, all of them are taking applications. And we will begin getting data from those counties. July 8th will be the first round. That data will be for June, so we will begin seeing the official data from counties to see how they're spending down. From the Relief Act, DHCD was allotted 5 different pots of money for programs, broadband expansion, emergency housing, nonprofit assistance, additional business assistance for entertainment venues, and then $2 million for main streets. This table shows you how those funds, what their purposes were, who the recipients were, whether it was the continuums of care for emergency housing programs, the local governments were allocated funds to set up a revolving fund for their nonprofits. We did another round of applications for entertainment venues, and we also allotted that $2 million out to main streets for Main Street relief for small businesses. All of this money will be spent by June 30th. The American Rescue Plan was passed in April. DHCD will get some funds from that bill. Another round of rental assistance will come to DHCD, $204 million. Program development for that is underway. We will be setting up a homeownership assistance fund or a mortgage assistance fund using $248 million that will be coming to Maryland. We are in program development for that, and we hope to open for applications in September. There's $300 million through a variety of fund sources that will be coming to DHCD for broadband. Multiple programs, multiple recipients. We do have money coming out of the dedicated purpose account for that. We will be working with ISPs, nonprofits, municipalities. We will begin rolling out those programs in the fall. We will be getting $23.9 million from the home program for homelessness prevention. We're still waiting on guidance from Treasury, but we believe that will be rolled out in the fall. And we also have been allotted $1.7 million for additional vouchers to help people that are on the verge of homelessness. Those vouchers will be allotted to DHCD shortly, and we hope to have tenants into those vouchers, very soon. And then the last piece is the local fiscal relief funds, the $528 million. The municipalities, there have been several calls with MML, DBM, DHCD. Right now, the municipalities are submitting their paperwork to DBM. DBM will review the paperwork, make sure that it's in good shape and good order, and it fits the formula. They will pass along the approval to DHCD, and DHCD will transfer the payment to the local. So that was, I just ran through that very, very quickly. It's a lot of money. I do have some other attachments. I don't know if it's loaded here or not. I have hard copies if it's not. Is it loaded, the attachments?
We've got hard copies and everyone
Okay.
here had the
Okay,
hard copies already.
great. Well, before I get into some of the attachments, do you have any questions for me?
Well, I'd like to thank you because
Oh,
it's a
okay.
very detailed presentation, and I want to thank your team. I already mentioned your secretary, but the entire team at DHCD has been, very impressive as far as the leadership in dispersing these critically needed funds. So,
Thank you. We have a really dedicated team of staff. They're very passionate about the programs, and they work really, really hard. So I will certainly take that message back.
well, my office referred a number of stakeholders to your office, and we were all very pleased to see the responsive and, well thought out concerns that were met.
Good.
And, but we have limited time. I do have a couple of, if I could focus on just a couple of the programs that you mentioned.
Sure.
The first is the rental assistance program.
Sure.
Obviously, the pandemic has had economic consequences for millions of Marylanders that have been devastating. And so many of them found themselves on the verge of losing their living space. I'm pleased the Hogan administration and the federal government have invested significant amounts of money in helping renters weather the very tumultuous economic times we've seen over the last year. But I do, if I could, Ms. Chaconas, just ask a couple of questions. And you may have already answered this. First, how much money, both state and federal, went towards rental assistance versus mortgage assistance?
So we have not done any mortgage assistance yet. All the money that the department has spent has been on rental assistance. We started with $20 million back in the fall. I'm sorry, $40 million. We started with a round from CDBG, where we allowed, we focused on rental assistance. So the local jurisdictions were able to use CDBG funds for rental assistance. And then the governor added another $20 million later in the fall.
Okay.
And all those funds, the money that came from the governor was the CRF money. And so that has been spent. The CDBG money will take, the locals will likely draw down over time as some of these other fund sources become more of a priority.
And how much of the rental assistance went to small landlords, for example, versus large landlords?
I don't have that number with me. I'll have to go back and take a look at the data, and I'm happy to provide you more details.
Okay. In slide 6, you discussed the $258 million that was received for rental assistance through the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, enacted in January. Did I hear correctly that you said only $286,861 has been expended of that? Or is that, did I get that wrong?
That number's a little misleading. It is a factual number. That is what the locals have expensed to DHCD so far. They are up and running. They are spending. They will draw reimbursement from the department. That 286 represents just a small amount of spending that occurred in early of May, mostly administrative expenses. I have over $8 million in expenses in hand at the department right now, and counties will start drawing down reimbursement right now.
And how soon will you disperse the $40 million that you mentioned?
So that is set aside for the state-funded program, the assisted housing. Our run rate for that program ranges anywhere from $2 million to about $4 million a month for assisted housing properties. So we expect to spend that $40 million by the end of the year. We will be taking a very close look at this program in August and September to see where the needs are, see where things are going very well, and reallocate money if needed.
Okay. Your last slide, Ms. Chaconas, you outlined the rental assistance. I believe it's $204 million from the American Rescue Plan, and you indicate the program development is still underway.
Correct.
Obviously, everybody is interested in the pace at which these funds are going to be distributed, especially to the unemployed Marylanders who are experiencing a dire recession, much different from everybody that I normally run into during the day.
Yeah, we understand.
More or less okay.
We understand. And so the first round of funding is the priority right now. That has to be spent by December 31st. We are in weekly huddle meetings internally, also with the counties, with stakeholders, assessing, talking, figuring out, and making sure that this money is getting out to tenants just as fast as we can possibly get it.
Thank you. Looking at the recipients of rental assistance and neighborhood revitalization funds, our internal records indicate that nearly $17 million went to out-of-state recipients, specifically 14 states, and the District of Columbia had some of the recipients. Can you comment on that? And I assume a lot of these recipients are parent companies of apartment communities located in Maryland.
Yeah, I'd like to confirm that with you, but my knee-jerk reaction is that's exactly what it is. They're properties for tenants here in Maryland. Their parent company or their back office or such is out of state.
Okay, and we can communicate with you.
Absolutely.
Down the road. Local governments are receiving a significant amount of money that's flowing, as you testified, through the Department of Housing and Community Development, resulting from the Relief Act of 2021 enacted by the Maryland legislature and from the most recent federal relief plan. What is your plan that, I know you mentioned that you had a deadline and you were in discussions, but how are we going to ensure that local governments are distributing these funds as expeditiously as possible?
We have executed grant agreements with those, with all local county governments for these funds, and we've outlined deadlines that they need to spend by. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I believe it is December 31st. We wanted it to be very meaningful, relevant money for businesses now.
And are those reporting requirements, are they going to require local governments to state how much and where the funds went?
Yes, we require compliance and regular reporting requirements as part of our grant agreements.
Thank you very much. Let me turn it over to Mr. Schaffel, and we'll just go the same order we went before for the work group.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the presentation.
Thank you.
Very informative. I just wanted to understand a little more. I'm very interested in the broadband program.
Oh gosh. Okay.
What does that mean? Are we helping people pay the bills for broadband? Are we building broadband?
Yeah. So let me think. A couple years ago, the governor established an Office of Rural Broadband, and it began to get funded through the capital budget for mainly infrastructure build out. And so that program has been established. It's been a growing program, and so that's what its purpose is. With the pandemic-related funds, the money that was received back in the fall, we had $8.7 million that went to school districts for device and services, so that the school districts could help their families and their students get access to online learning. The $15 million that was provided through the GEAR funds is for a network for the school districts, so that they can provide broadband and better online remote learning for their students. This most recent round of $300 million will be covering a lot of different purposes. Infrastructure build out will absolutely be a big chunk of that. We will also be doing service fee subsidies to help low-income residents. We will be providing devices through county relationships for low-income residents. There is money that will be going out to nonprofits for digital inclusion and education and outreach. And we will also be working with municipals to identify their infrastructure areas, their areas where there is no service. So there will be specific money provided for them to build out some infrastructure. So it will be a lot of different efforts all happening at one time.
It's great. It's a great place to invest. Wish we'd obviously done it much more. So before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's a heavy lift.
Yeah.
We have a really excellent director. Part of the money that's coming through does allow him to hire some new staff. But we realize the critical, the need was identified before the pandemic. Everyone put a magnifying glass on top of it during the pandemic.
Right. I've been hearing more and more about these broadband through satellite. Right, I know Elon Musk is doing this.
Yeah.
And that factoring in all of this, it'd be a shame for us to build out all this physical.
I don't want to pretend to be an expert. Those names and words I get floated all the time, so they all know about it, and it's part of it. It's part of the solution. I don't know how it factors into this money.
Okay.
But I'm happy to get you in touch with Rick Gordon if you'd like to talk to him more. Super educated, and he loves talking about it, so he can talk you through a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think I'd enjoy that. That's all.
Good.
Yeah, thank you.
Happy to do that.
Can he help me with my Google account? Yeah, no, I'm kidding. This digital connectivity is a big issue, obviously, and concerns the federal government, state government, local governments,
Yeah.
private sector, big companies, small companies. And
Yeah.
it's all subject to technology improvements. Mr. Hildebrand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. Did have one question. I think as you were going through the presentation, you said some of these funds are not designed to be spent for like another 3 years.
Correct.
Deadline. So I was just trying to wrap my head around, we have the people with immediate needs over the last year that needed the rental assistance, the other things. So for that part of the money, did we get it out in time so that it did its intended purpose versus people who need assistance now will have money available in 3 years if things are still lingering? Just want to make sure we hit our target.
Yeah, the only reason why that money hasn't been spent is because other funds became available that were either more flexible or had a shorter time frame. So it actually is helpful because those other funds can they all have different roles, different strings attached. And so all of these entities, nonprofits, local governments are balancing the different fund source and all of the rules and restrictions. And so they will pull from those fund sources as they need them. The federal dollars that we got up front that have the longer time horizon, they will be needed. They're just sitting to the side while these other funds get spent down faster.
Now the next couple questions may sound really familiar. So you had said how much out of the 1.78-ish billion, that 35 million was for the state. So for all of these programs you've talked about, was your agency given any funds or able to use some of these funds to add staff resources to help manage all of these programs? Or did it fall to the people and you just tripled their work?
Yeah, most of the federal dollars do have some administrative expenses allowed where we can do some hiring. Most of these programs we were able to absorb and to our existing staff were able to manage. The two programs where we need to staff up are the rental assistance, both ERAP 1.0 and 2.0. We've had to hire some new staff, which are fantastic people. We're happy to have them. And then the mortgage assistance program.
Do you know how many FTEs you added or are adding for those?
We're going to be hiring contractual staff for ERAP 1.0. We are hiring probably 6 to 8 people. The mortgage assistance program, that one may be more labor intensive because if they're loans, they have to be serviced and it's a more complicated structure. So, we may have to hire, I don't know how that program is going to be designed quite yet, but it'll probably be in the dozens.
Okay. Thank you. And then what audits have either been put in place and conducted or are coming down the pike to ensure that this aid went to legitimate Maryland citizens and businesses who were in dire need and still are?
Yeah, so we have an internal auditor who's been at the table from the beginning, kind of monitoring process and procedures. DHCD had a lot of process and procedures in place from our existing programs. So for most of this money, it wasn't quite plug and play, but we had a process and we had systems and we had procedures where we could just pull from what we already do. So the internal auditor has been a part of the discussion. He's been at the table for many of these meetings and watching how we set things up. We are in the weeds right now of compliance. And so we will continue to do internal auditing, doing some testing, making sure that who we paid is who we were supposed to pay. And then we'll also be getting in those compliance and quarterly reports from our recipients, where we will monitor as well.
Thank you very much. And as you collect and get all that together, if you could just give us a nice executive summary, I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Happy to do it.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mr. Riley, followed by Ms. Zink, and then concluded by my indispensable Deputy Comptroller. And thank you, Robin, for everything. Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Question for you. With a lot of these programs, because there's so much federal money, are there guidelines in place for how you have to distribute the monies as opposed to something that you just got hit with and you have to figure out how to do it?
That's correct. The first round of money so if it's coming through one of an existing programs such as CDBG, CSBG, those have rules that we have to follow, and there's strict guidelines, and there's a lot of reporting back to federal agencies on that money. With the rental assistance and the mortgage assistance, we are being driven right now by guidance from Treasury, which isn't as tidy and as clean as kind of federal regulations, but there's a lot of technical training and oversight being driven at the federal level by some of our trade organizations to make sure that what the states are doing for rental assistance and the mortgage assistance, that the right questions are getting asked, that everybody understands what the guidance means, and that we're all reporting back to the Treasury the right data.
And then would there be an expectation that the feds will be coming in to audit you and these funds specifically because of the volume of the funds?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm preparing for that completely, and we'll be ready.
Okay. And then I guess a question then kind of follow up that we may have had before is, were you seeing, even though there were guidelines, there were people coming out of the woodwork maybe that you hadn't dealt with before. Were you noticing any fraud, any more fraudulent claims or anything along that line that struck you because of this?
We did not see any. Similar to the Department of Commerce, for most of these application processes, perhaps there were some fraudulent applications that we're trying to get through, but because of the procedures of the process, they didn't become completed applications that actually got approved. So maybe there were some bad actors in there, but none of them would have gotten through the approval process to get paid. Most of our money went to, a completed application where documents were verified. There were several steps to the approval process, and then they were set up as vendors in the system where they, were in good standing. They had active W-9s. And so our application process would have naturally pushed them out of an approval at some point.
Okay. And would a lot of these people have been potentially businesses, companies, individuals you dealt with in the past anyway, because rental assistance or?
I don't know that, not on a tenant basis, but in terms of the local county programs, the assisted housing properties, these are all our peers. We work with them on many levels through the year on different programs. And so, there's a lot of active engagement of the stakeholders to make sure that the applications are tight, that procedures are established, and that data is being reported back to us in a timely manner.
And then I guess the last question is, one of the additional documents that didn't have a chance to go over, appreciate everything you put this tremendous amount of information to go over with the entertainment venues.
Mm-hmm.
Was that state money for that, or was that federal and state? It's like
So
about-
for the entertainment venues, I think round one, that was in the fall, that was rainy day money.
Okay.
And then the second round, which was an additional 10 million, came through the Relief Act. And those funds, I believe, are going to be swapped over from rainy day to American Rescue Plan money.
And did you have to come up with the guidelines for the first 30 million, I guess? You
For
guys had to
both.
come up with that
We
stuff?
did. We worked with some stakeholder groups. We wanted input from them. And so we put together a NOFA. We published the NOFA. The entertainment venues went through an application portal. And we did a press release afterwards announcing all of the awards, and then money was given out.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Well-deserved recipients, by the way, because, I mean, talk about being devastated. They were definitely
Yeah.
in need of help. So hats off to you guys. Sandy, please.
Sure. Pleasure to meet you. We, as you know, the entertainment venues, it's a common thread because the phones ring off the hook, of course, from the very vendors. Is there any sense that any money that may be unspent in other categories will be able to be diverted to them? I've just heard some pretty sad stories of these entertainment guys.
It's a good question. I'm happy to think about that and get back to you. We have accounted for, committed, encumbered almost every penny that we have that has any sort of flexibility to it. But I think we can think about that, and if there's still the need and the desire now that they're open, maybe that is tempered a little bit. But in a few months, we can do a check-in with them to see how they're doing and see whether additional funding might be needed.
They're just the ones that have been most vocal recently.
Sure.
They're quite from. And then the other question I had, and I'll turn it back to Sean, is just, you mentioned setting up the mortgage program and a few of the other housing assistance programs. Are you partnering with other states to help build best practices for how to distribute those funds, or is there a group?
Yeah, so we have the National Council of State Housing Agencies. It's kind of our umbrella trade organization, and they facilitate leadership type phone calls, but they also facilitate very operational technical phone calls for states to call in and share best practices. Some of the housing finance agencies and other state agencies are already developing their model. All of us have to put together a plan to submit to Treasury for the mortgage assistance program that will be submitted to them in a few weeks. And so that plan has to be approved by Treasury. We're working closely with them because there's still more guidance coming out from them. But yes, we are. Best practices is a big part of this discussion.
And then I guess my last kind of personal question here is: do you expect that are we going to be dispersing all of those mortgage payments, or I'm curious as to the processes.
I don't know yet.
Okay.
I don't know yet. I don't know yet. We're still, some of the details of how that program is going to work. We have it mapped out. We just are still putting it on paper. And, we have to work with a lot of servicers. And so there's still some details, but I would welcome a conversation with you about that in the coming weeks.
Speaking of national groups, let me introduce the winner of the Tax Administrator of the Year by the National Group of Tax Administrators, our Deputy Comptroller, Sharon Bernardi, and looking forward to best practices from that organization. But thank you for sharing them, if you could, with us from your national group.
You were looking at my paper, Mr. Comptroller. That was my question, because I know that you and Sandy touched base on some of the national associations, but I did wonder if your internal auditor belonged to NASDAQ or to any other national associations, and have they published any reports or white papers on these best practices? And if so, if you would share them with the group.
I don't have that right now. I'm happy to do that. I know he is. I just don't have it right here, but I'm happy to follow up afterwards.
Okay, so let me thank the Chief of Staff, Robin Chaconas, and also Sarah Shepard, the Director of Education and Workforce for the Maryland Department of Commerce. Both of these presentations have been excellent, and we appreciate it. Obviously, if you have additional information or if we have some questions, we'd love to be in contact.
Sure, happy to do
Thank you
so.
very much.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.
This is the end of the meeting, and we're going to have a meeting next month or possibly right at the beginning of August on, I believe it's unemployment, but it could be another exciting subject concerning the significant flow of 62 billion, maybe it's more than that, that's come into the state of Maryland from the federal government, how important that is. But most of all, did it go to the people who really needed it? And was it affected by an egregious amount of fraud? And was there any kind of pandemic profiteering by the private sector? Those are things that we just want to make sure we understand. And where there were abuses, we want to make sure that the state and the agencies are aware and the local governments are aware so that we can deliver better service. But thank everybody who's been viewing this, and I want to thank the members of the work group. This is a kind of complicated, ever-moving, ever-changing situation, but I'm encouraged by what we've been able to come up with. Thank you.
Thank you.